The wine goblet slipped first, then the floor tilted, and Alira Voss went down with it, right in front of the throne, right in the middle of the coronation of King Kaelin Ashgrave. For one full second, nobody in the great hall moved. 600 nobles in silk and fur stood frozen, mid-breath, mid-bow, mid-whisper. The only sound was the goblet rolling across the marble, spilling a thin red line toward the foot of the dais. Then the king moved. He was not supposed to move. He was supposed to be finishing his oath, one hand still raised toward the crown that hovered above his head on a velvet cushion, held by the eldest priest in the kingdom. The entire ceremony existed to put that crown on his head in front of every important person in the land. Kaelin stepped off the dais instead, crossed the space between himself and a servant girl nobody had noticed until she stopped being invisible, and knelt down beside her. Alira heard voices before she understood the words. Her whole body felt like it had been unplugged from something. She had been standing at the edge of the hall for 2 hours, holding a tray she was not allowed to set down, wearing a uniform 2 sizes too tight because the seamstress had run out of time, and trying very hard not to think about the fact that she had not eaten since the day before. She remembered thinking the chandelier looked too bright. She remembered the taste of copper in her mouth. After that, nothing, until a pair of hands, warm and much too careful for a king, slid under her shoulders. "Someone get water," Kaelin said. His voice did not sound like the voice he had used 2 minutes earlier to speak his vows. That voice had been formal, distant, built for an audience of 600. This voice was low, and it was only for her. Alira opened her eyes to a face she had only ever seen from a distance, across the width of a room, framed by torchlight and armor. This close, she could see there was a small scar above his left eyebrow, and that his eyes were the color of the sea right before a storm, not quite gray and not quite green. She had spent 3 years training herself to look at that face for no longer than half a second before dropping her gaze. Looking too long at a king was its own kind of danger. She dropped her gaze now, out of habit, and found that she could not look away from the floor either, because the floor was spinning. "Your Majesty," she managed, and her voice came out cracked. "I am so sorry. I did not mean." "Do not apologize to me," Kaelin said. Behind him, she heard the rustle of robes, the sharp intake of breath from 100 throats at once. Someone near the front, she thought it might be Lord Corwin, head of the council, cleared his throat in the specific way powerful men clear their throats when they want a situation corrected without having to ask for it directly. "Your Majesty," Corwin said, "the ceremony can continue. The girl will be attended to." Kaelin did not look up at him. He kept his eyes on Alira, one hand steady behind her head, the other testing the pulse at her wrist with a gentleness that did not match the size of his hands or the weight of the sword still strapped across his back from the ceremonial procession. "The ceremony is finished for today," Kaelin said. A silence dropped over the hall so complete that Alira could hear her own heartbeat. "Your Majesty," Corwin tried again, and this time there was an edge under the respect. "The crown has not yet been placed. 600 guests have traveled from every corner of the kingdom to witness this. To pause now, over a servant's fainting spell, would send a message we cannot afford to send." Kaelin finally looked up. Alira, still lying against his arm, felt something shift in the air around them, the way the air shifts right before lightning finds the ground. "Then let it send that message," Kaelin said. "Clear the hall." Nobody moved. "I said, clear the hall." It was not loud. He did not shout it. But something in the 4 words made the guards along the walls straighten, made the priest holding the crown take an involuntary step backward, made 600 of the most powerful people in the kingdom begin, one by one, to bow and withdraw toward the great doors, murmuring to each other in a low, rising static of confusion and scandal that would not stop rising for weeks. Kaelin did not wait for the hall to finish emptying. He gathered Alira up against his chest as if she weighed nothing at all, though she knew for a fact that she weighed enough for her uniform to strain at the seams, and he carried her out through a side door that led away from the crowd, away from the whispers, away from the crown still sitting untouched on its velvet cushion behind him. She should have protested. A servant did not get carried anywhere by a king, not through the front hall of his own coronation, not while 600 witnesses turned their heads to watch him do it. She knew, even through the fog pressing against the inside of her skull, that this single moment would be repeated in every dining hall and guard post and noble house in the kingdom by nightfall, and that none of the versions people told each other would be kind to her. But she could not make her mouth form the protest. Her body had made a decision without asking her opinion, and the decision was to go still against the warmth of his chest and let herself be carried. "Stay with me," Kaelin said quietly, as the side door swung shut behind them and the noise of the hall fell away. "Just a little further." "I am fine," Elira whispered, which was a lie, and they both seemed to know it. He did not answer that. He only walked faster, down a corridor lined with old tapestries, past guards who flattened themselves against the walls without asking a single question, because a certain look on a king's face is its own kind of order. Elira let her eyes fall shut again, just for a moment, just to rest them against the strange, unbearable brightness of everything that had happened in the last 2 minutes. When she opened them again, the ceiling had changed. They were somewhere else now, somewhere quieter, with tall windows and pale curtains and the smell of dried lavender in the air. "Where?" she started. "My private study," Kaelin said. "Nobody will look for you here." He set her down, not on the floor, not on a hard bench meant for servants waiting to be summoned, but on a wide couch upholstered in dark green velvet, the kind of furniture Elira had only ever dusted, never sat on. She tried to sit up straight, tried to arrange herself into something smaller and more appropriate, and Kaelin's hand came down gently on her shoulder, not forcing her, just asking her to stop. "You are not going anywhere until someone has looked at you," he said. "I have work to finish. The wine service is the least of my concerns right now," Kaelin said, and there was something almost sharp in his voice, something that made Elira look up at him properly for the first time since he had knelt beside her on the marble floor. His jaw was tight. His eyes had not left her face since the hall. "You do not even know my name," she said, before she could stop herself. Something flickered across his expression, quick and unreadable, gone before she could name it. "Elira," he said. "Elira Voss. Third house servant, assigned to the coronation wine service 4 months ago, transferred from the eastern wing." Elira stared at him. She had never told him her name. She had never spoken to him at all, not once, not in 4 months of walking the halls of his castle with her eyes fixed carefully on the floor. "How do you—" she started, and stopped. Kaelin looked away first, toward the window, toward the pale afternoon light falling across the lavender-scented room, and for a moment he looked less like a king and more like a man carrying something heavy that he had no intention of putting down in front of her, not yet. "There will be time for that conversation," he said quietly. "Right now, you need a healer, and I need you to promise me you will not disappear the moment my back is turned." "I would never disobey a direct order from the king," Elira said, and there was a thin, exhausted thread of humor in it, the first she had allowed herself since she had woken up on the floor of the great hall. The corner of his mouth moved, almost a smile, gone as quickly as it came. "Good," he said, "because that was one." He crossed to the door, spoke a low command to someone waiting outside, and within minutes the room filled with the quiet, efficient bustle of a healer arriving with a case of instruments and a face carefully arranged into professional calm. Kaelin did not leave. He stood by the window with his arms crossed, watching every movement in the room, with an intensity that made the healer's hands shake slightly as she checked Elira's pulse, her breathing, the color under her eyes. "When did you last eat, dear?" the healer asked, not unkindly. Elira hesitated, and that hesitation was answer enough. Kaelin's jaw tightened again, and this time Elira saw it clearly, saw the effort it took him to stay quiet, to let the healer do her work instead of demanding answers himself. Outside the study door, she could hear the castle beginning to stir with the news of what had happened, servants running messages down corridors, doors opening and closing faster than usual, the particular hum of a place that has just witnessed something it does not yet know how to explain to itself. The coronation of King Kalen Ashgrave had been interrupted before the crown ever touched his head, and by nightfall, every soul in the kingdom would know exactly why, though none of them would know the whole truth of it. Not yet, not even the two people sitting in that quiet, lavender-scented room, waiting to find out together. Alira watched the healer's hands move over her wrist, and thought, distantly, that whatever came next would not let her go back to being invisible again. She was not sure yet whether that frightened her or not. Across the room, Kalen watched her with an expression she could not read, and did not try to explain, and somewhere far below them, in the emptied great hall, the crown still sat untouched on its velvet cushion, waiting for a ceremony that had not yet finished, and might not finish for a long time still. The healer left with a list of instructions and a promise to return by evening, and the moment the door clicked shut behind her, Alira tried to stand. "Do not," Kalen said, without turning from the window. "I have missed half a day of work. Someone will notice." "Someone already noticed," he said. "The entire kingdom noticed. I do not think one more hour is going to change how deep that particular hole is." Alira sat back down, because her legs had made the decision before her pride could argue with them. She studied the room instead, the shelves of ledgers, the maps pinned with small colored markers, the single sword hung above the fireplace that looked older than the castle itself. It was not the room of a man who spent his time on ceremony. It was the room of a man who worked. "Why did you know my name?" she asked, because the question had been sitting in her chest since the moment he had said it, and she was too tired to keep holding it there politely. Kalen turned from the window. For a long moment he did not answer, and Alira thought he might simply refuse, the way kings were allowed to refuse anything they liked. "I make it a habit to know who serves in my household," he said finally. "All of them, not just you." It was a careful answer. It was also, she was fairly certain, not the whole truth. She let it sit anyway, because pressing a king for more than he was willing to give did not seem like the wisest use of the strength she had left. A sharp knock interrupted whatever silence might have followed. Kalen's advisor, a narrow, sharp-eyed man named Edwin, entered without waiting for permission, a habit that told Alira exactly how long he had served this king and how much license that service had earned him. "Your Majesty," Edwin said, with a glance at Alira that was not unkind, but was certainly assessing. "The council is asking when the ceremony will resume. Lord Corwin, in particular, is asking rather loudly. Tell Lord Corwin the ceremony will resume when I decide it resumes," Kalen said. "I did tell him that." He did not enjoy hearing it a second time. Edwin's mouth twitched, the closest thing to humor Alira had seen since she woke up. "There is also the matter of Lady Serana. She has arrived a day early and is asking to see you immediately." Something in Kalen's shoulders changed, a subtle tightening that Alira noticed only because she had spent years learning to read the smallest signals of powerful people, a skill that had kept her safe more than once. "Tell her I am occupied with a matter of state," Kalen said. Edwin's eyebrows rose slightly. "Is that what we are calling it?" "Edwin." "Understood, Your Majesty." Edwin bowed, shot one more unreadable glance at Alira, and left as quickly as he had entered. Alira waited until the door was closed before she spoke. "Lady Serana," she said carefully, "you're betrothed." "An arrangement," Kalen said, "made by my father, before he died, to secure peace with House Draven. It has very little to do with me. It has a great deal to do with you, if you are meant to marry her." He looked at her then, a long, searching look that made Alira suddenly aware of how close they were sitting, how the lavender-scented air between them had grown quiet, in a way that felt dangerous, though nothing dangerous had been said at all. "You are very direct for a servant addressing her king," he said, but there was no anger in it. "I fainted in front of 600 people this morning," Alira said. "I think whatever dignity I had left already left the room with the crowd." For the first time since she had known his face existed, Kalen laughed, a short, surprised sound, quickly caught and put away, but real while it lasted. "That is fair," he admitted. The moment loosened something between them, and for a little while they simply sat, not speaking of crowns or councils or betrothed ladies waiting outside doors, until a servant arrived with a tray of food Elira had not asked for and did not remember Kaelin ordering. "Eat," he said, before she could protest. "All of it. That was not a request from a king. That was a request from someone who watched you hit the floor this morning and does not intend to watch it happen twice." She ate, because arguing with him seemed to cost more energy than she currently owned, and because some small, unguarded part of her did not want to argue at all. By the time evening fell, word of the interrupted coronation had traveled through every level of the castle, from the kitchens to the council chamber to the guest quarters where Lady Serana Draven was, at that very moment, pacing a room with a temper that matched the deep red of her traveling gown. "He carried a servant girl out of his own coronation," Serana said to her lady's maid, a thin woman named Ronwyn, who had learned, over the years, that the wisest response to Serana's temper was silence, in front of the entire council, in front of every noble house that matters. Ronwyn said nothing, which Serana took, correctly, as agreement. "Find out who she is," Serana said. "Everything. Where she is from, how long she has served here, who her family is, whether she has ever spoken to him before today. And if there is nothing to find?" Serana's smile was thin and precise, the smile of a woman who had spent her whole life learning that patience was a weapon sharper than any blade. "There is always something to find," she said. "People like her do not simply appear in a coronation hall by accident." Meanwhile, in the private study, Elira had finally convinced Kaelin to let her walk back to the servants' quarters on her own 2 feet, though he insisted on sending 2 guards with her, a gesture that embarrassed her nearly as much as being carried through the great hall had. The walk back through the castle corridors felt different than it had that morning. Servants who had never so much as glanced at her before now stopped what they were doing to stare, whispering behind hands the moment she passed. By the time she reached the small room she shared with 2 other girls, the whispering had already outpaced her, arriving before she did. Her roommate, a quick, kind-eyed girl named Leora, was waiting by the door, arms crossed, an expression somewhere between worry and barely restrained excitement. "You are the only topic of conversation in this entire castle," Leora said, before Elira had even stepped inside. "Do you have any idea what people are saying?" "I can imagine," Elira said, sitting heavily on her narrow bed. "They are saying he has never once done anything like that in his life. Not for a noble, not for a guest, not for anyone. Greta from the kitchen says he did not even flinch when his own father collapsed at a council meeting 2 winters ago. He just kept talking business while the healers worked. But you," Leora leaned forward, lowering her voice as if the walls themselves might be listening. "You, he picked up off the floor with his own hands, in front of everyone, and cancelled his own coronation." "It was not cancelled. It was postponed." "Elira." Leora's voice had gone serious now, all the teasing gone out of it. "Do you understand what you have just become? Overnight, you went from a name nobody in that hall could have told you if you had asked, to the single thing every noble house in this kingdom is going to be talking about for months." Elira lay back on her bed and stared at the low wooden ceiling above her, the same ceiling she had stared at every night for 3 years. Unchanged, unremarkable, safe. It did not feel safe anymore. It felt like the ceiling of a room she was about to be asked to leave. "I did not ask for any of this," she said quietly. "I know," Leora said, gentler now, "but I do not think that is going to matter very much to the people who are already deciding what to do about it." Outside the small window of their shared room, the castle settled into its evening routines, torches lit along the outer walls, the distant sound of the council still arguing somewhere in the stone corridors above them, and further still, in a room with tall windows and pale curtains, King Kaelin Ashgrave stood alone with a letter in his hand that he had received only an hour earlier, one that named a debt from his father's reign that he had never known existed, a debt tied to a family name he had heard only once before today, spoken quietly by a healer checking a servant's pulse. Voss. He read the letter 3 times before he set it down, and when he finally did, his expression was not the expression of a man thinking about crowns, or councils, or betrothed ladies waiting in guest chambers. It was the expression of a man who had just understood that the woman he carried out of his own coronation was not a stranger at all, and that the truth of who she really was would change far more than a single ceremony. 3 days passed before Alira was summoned to the guest wing, and the summons did not come from the king. It came from Lady Serana Draven, delivered by Ronwin in a tone so carefully neutral that Alira understood, immediately, that neutrality was the most dangerous tone available to her. She followed the maid through corridors she had never walked before, past guards in the deep red of House Draven, until she reached a set of doors carved with a hawk mid-strike, wings spread, talons out. Serana was seated by the window when Alira entered, a cup of tea untouched beside her, her posture so perfectly composed it looked less like sitting and more like a portrait someone had arranged in advance. "So," Serana said, without looking up, "this is the girl who stopped a coronation." "My lady," Alira said, dropping into the correct bow, the one 3 years of service had carved into her muscles so deeply she did not have to think about it anymore. "Sit." There was no chair offered for her, and Alira understood the instruction was not meant kindly. She remained standing. Serana finally looked up, and her eyes moved over Alira slowly, the way a merchant examines livestock before deciding whether it is worth the price being asked. "You do not look like much," she said. "I confess, I expected something more. A great beauty, perhaps. Some obvious explanation for why a king would humiliate himself in front of 600 witnesses. I did not ask him to do anything, my lady." "No," Serana agreed. "I do not imagine you did. Men like Kalen do not need to be asked. They simply act, and the rest of us are left to clean up whatever mess follows." She rose from her seat, unhurried, and crossed the room until she stood close enough that Alira could smell the heavy floral perfume woven into the fabric of her gown. "Tell me about your family." "There is little to tell. My parents died when I was young. I was raised in the eastern villages before I came to serve here." "How convenient," Serana said softly. "No family to speak of. No one to ask questions on your behalf. No one to notice if certain arrangements were made." Alira felt something cold settle low in her stomach, a warning that had kept her alive through worse situations than this one. "What arrangements, my lady?" Serana smiled, and it was not a smile that reached anywhere near warmth. The kind that would return you quietly to the eastern villages, with enough coin to build a comfortable life somewhere no one would ever think to ask about a king's coronation, or the girl who once fainted at the foot of his throne. "Are you asking me to leave?" "I am asking you to consider what you actually want, girl. Do you imagine, even for one moment, that a man like Kalen Ashgrave intends anything honorable by carrying a servant through his own great hall? Do you understand what happens to women like you, in stories like this one, once the novelty fades and the crown settles onto someone else's head?" Alira did not answer immediately, because some small, treacherous part of her had already asked herself the same question, alone, at night, staring at that same low wooden ceiling. "I do not know what he intends," she said finally. "I have not asked him." "Then perhaps you should," Serana said, "before you find yourself the subject of a very different kind of story, one where the ending is not kind to servants who forget their place." The meeting ended without threats spoken plainly, because Serana was too skilled for anything so obvious, but Alira left the guest wing with her hands trembling and a coldness in her chest that no amount of walking seemed able to shake loose. She did not tell Kalen about the meeting. She told herself this was because it was not her place, that a servant did not run to a king with tales about his betrothed, that whatever passed between herself and Serana Draven belonged to a world of politics Alira had no standing to enter. She told herself several reasons, and none of them were fully true, and she knew it even as she repeated them. But secrets in a castle this size did not stay buried for long. 2 days later, Kaelin found her in the small garden behind the kitchens, where she had gone to breathe air that did not smell of lavender or floral perfume, or anything that reminded her of rooms she was not meant to belong in. He did not announce himself. She simply became aware of him standing at the edge of the garden path, watching her the way he had watched her in his study, an intensity that had not lessened in the days since the coronation. "Lady Serana came to see you," he said. Elira went still. "How did you know that?" "Because very little happens in this castle that I do not eventually hear about, and because Ronwyn has served House Draven for 11 years and has grown tired of the way her lady treats the people beneath her." Kaelin crossed the garden path until he stood close enough that Elira had to tilt her head to meet his eyes. "What did she say to you?" "It does not matter." "Elira." It was the first time he had used her name without a title in front of it, and something about the plainness of it, the way it landed without ceremony, undid whatever careful composure she had been holding together for 2 days straight. "She offered me coin," Elira said, "to leave quietly, to go back to the eastern villages and disappear before I became, in her words, the subject of a story with an unkind ending." Kaelin's expression darkened in a way Elira had not seen before, something controlled but unmistakably furious underneath the surface. "She threatened you." "She did not threaten anything directly. She is far too careful for that." "That is exactly what makes it a threat," Kaelin said. "The women who never say the dangerous thing out loud are always the most dangerous ones in the room." He turned away from her then, toward the low garden wall, and stood in silence for a long moment, his jaw working through something Elira could not name. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped lower, quieter, as if the words cost him something to release into the air. "My father made that betrothal when I was 14 years old," he said. "House Draven controls the eastern trade roads. Without their cooperation, half this kingdom would starve within 2 winters. I have spent my entire adult life being told that marrying Serana Draven is not a choice. It is a debt owed to every farmer and merchant who depends on those roads staying open." "Then perhaps it is a debt you should honor," Elira said, though the words tasted like ash the moment they left her mouth. Kaelin turned to look at her, and there was something raw in his expression now, something that had nothing to do with kings or crowns or debts owed to trade roads. "I have spent my entire adult life honoring debts that were never mine to begin with," he said. "I have never once, in 26 years, chosen a single thing for myself. Not my education, not my duties, not the woman I am supposed to marry. And then you collapsed on that floor, and for the first time in my life, I did something because I wanted to, not because someone told me it was owed." The garden had gone very quiet around them, the kind of quiet that made every small sound feel enormous. The rustle of leaves, the distant clatter of the kitchens, the sound of Elira's own breath catching in her chest. "You do not know me," she said softly. "Whatever you felt that day, it was not about me. It was about a moment, a crown you were tired of wearing before it even touched your head." "That is not true." "How would you know it is not true? We have exchanged perhaps 20 sentences in our entire lives, Your Majesty, and half of them have happened in the last 5 minutes." Something shifted across his face, a decision being made behind his eyes, and for a moment, Elira thought he might tell her something enormous, something that would change the shape of everything between them. Instead, he simply said, "There is a letter I received the night of the coronation, a letter concerning your family name. I have not yet decided how to tell you what it contains, because I do not fully understand it myself, and I did not want to hand you an unfinished truth." Elira felt the cold return to her chest, sharper this time. "What kind of letter?" "One that suggests your family was owed something by the crown, a very long time ago, something my father may have deliberately buried." Before Elira could ask another question, the sound of hurried footsteps approached from the direction of the main castle, and Edwin appeared at the garden entrance, out of breath, his usual composure entirely absent. "Your Majesty," he said, "you need to come to the council chamber immediately. Lord Corwin has called an emergency session. Someone has brought forward a formal challenge to the succession." Kaelin's expression went hard and still, the softness of a moment ago, vanishing behind the mask Elira had first seen across the width of a crowded hall. On what grounds? Edwin's eyes flicked briefly to Elira, before returning to the king. On the grounds, Your Majesty, that a coronation interrupted before completion may not be a valid coronation at all. Lord Corwin is arguing that the crown never legally passed to you, and that the throne is, at this moment, formally vacant. The words landed in the garden like a stone dropped into still water, spreading outward in ripples neither of them could stop. That is absurd, Kaelin said. The ceremony was postponed, not voided. I agree, Your Majesty. Unfortunately, absurd arguments have a way of gaining strength when the people making them control half the kingdom's grain reserves, and every noble house owes them a favor. Edwin's gaze moved to Elira again, more pointed this time. There are already voices in that chamber, suggesting the postponement was itself improper. Some are asking whether a king's judgment can be trusted, if he would halt his own coronation over a servant. Elira felt the full weight of those words settle onto her shoulders, the understanding, cold and immediate, that whatever had happened between herself and Kaelin in the days since the coronation was no longer a private matter contained within a lavender-scented study or a quiet garden path. It had become a weapon, and it was already being used. I will come, Kaelin said. To Elira, he added quietly, stay here. Do not go near the guest wing again without telling me first. You cannot protect me from Lady Serana and fight a challenge to your throne in the same afternoon, Elira said. Watch me, Kaelin said, and then he was gone, striding back toward the castle with Edwin hurrying to match his pace, leaving Elira alone in the small garden with nothing but the sound of her own uneven breathing and the enormous, terrifying knowledge that whatever was coming next, there would be no quiet corner of this castle left untouched by it. The council chamber was already loud when Kaelin arrived, a dozen voices layered over each other, rising toward the vaulted ceiling in a noise that sounded less like governance and more like a marketplace haggling over a life. Lord Corwin stood at the center of it, hands folded behind his back, the picture of calm reason surrounded by a storm he had clearly built himself. Your Majesty, he said, as Kaelin entered, we are grateful you could join us. There are urgent matters requiring the crown's attention, or rather, the question of whether a crown currently exists to attend to anything at all. The ceremony was postponed, Kaelin said, taking his place at the head of the long table. Not voided. I fail to see the urgency. With respect, Your Majesty, the law is not so flexible as your patience. Corwin produced a thin, leather-bound volume and opened it to a marked page. The Ashgrave Coronation Codex, established by your great-grandfather, states plainly that the crown must be placed upon the sovereign's head within the same ceremony in which the oath is spoken, without interruption, or the ceremony must be considered incomplete and repeated from its beginning, with full formal notice given to all noble houses no less than 30 days in advance. Then we repeat it, Kaelin said. 30 days is not an unreasonable delay. 30 days, Corwin said, during which the throne sits formally vacant and during which certain parties may argue that the crown ought to be reconsidered entirely, rather than simply reissued to the same candidate. The chamber erupted again, voices overlapping, and Kaelin understood, watching the faces around the table, exactly how many of them had been waiting years for an opening like this one. His father had ruled with an iron patience that left few enemies room to breathe. Kaelin had inherited the throne, but not yet, in the eyes of half this room, the authority that came with it. Say what you actually mean, Corwin, Kaelin said quietly, and the chamber slowly fell silent to hear it. You are not concerned with codices and ceremonies. You are concerned that a king who would stop his own coronation for a servant girl is a king who cannot be trusted to make decisions with the kingdom's interests in mind. Corwin did not flinch. I am concerned, Your Majesty, that a king who acts on impulse in front of 600 witnesses may act on impulse in matters of greater consequence, trade agreements, military alliances, the succession itself. He let that last phrase hang in the air deliberately. Some in this chamber wonder whether your judgment, at this moment, can be relied upon. My judgment carried an unconscious woman to a healer instead of finishing a ceremony, Kalen said. If that is the standard by which you intend to measure a king's fitness to rule, I would ask this chamber to consider what it says about the rest of you, that such basic decency reads to you as instability. A murmur moved through the room, some approving, some clearly not, and Kalen understood that the battle here would not be won with a single sharp reply. It would be won, if it could be won at all, through the slow, grinding work of votes and alliances and favors called in over the coming days. I propose the ceremony be completed within the week, Kalen said. Not 30 days. I will not leave this kingdom without a settled crown for a full month, while ambitious men decide whether they prefer the throne empty. The codex is specific about the notice period, Corwin said. The codex was written by my great-grandfather, who never once faced a challenge to his own succession, Kalen said. I am asking this council to vote on an exception. 1 week. If the council refuses, we will discuss the matter further. But I will not sit here and let this drag into a month of uncertainty simply because it is convenient for some of you. The vote, when it finally came after 2 more hours of argument, favored Kalen by a narrow margin, 7 votes to 5, a victory so thin it felt more like a warning than a resolution. Corwin accepted the outcome with a small, unbothered bow that told Kalen the fight was far from finished, merely paused. By the time Kalen returned to his private study that evening, exhaustion had settled into every part of him, the particular kind that comes from holding a room together through sheer will alone. He found Elira waiting outside the door, against his explicit instruction to stay away from anywhere near the council wing, and he was too tired to be properly frustrated about it. You should not be here, he said. I heard what happened in the chamber, Elira said. I wanted to know if you were all right. Something in the plainness of that concern, offered without artifice, without the careful calculation Elira had watched Serana Draven perform 3 days earlier, undid the last of Kalen's composure. He opened the study door and gestured her inside. I have the letter, he said, once the door was closed. The one about your family. I think it is time you saw it yourself. He crossed to a locked drawer, produced a folded parchment, and handed it to her without further ceremony. Elira unfolded it with hands that were not entirely steady, and read words that rearranged everything she had believed about her own life. The letter, written in a careful court hand and sealed with the crest of the Eastern Territories, named a debt owed by the crown to the Voss family, dating back nearly 20 years, to a period when a fever had swept through the eastern villages, and a young healer named Marin Voss had worked without rest for 3 months to contain it, saving, by the letter's own account, over 400 lives, including several members of the noble houses who now sat in the council chamber upstairs. In gratitude, the crown had promised the Voss family a formal title and land, a promise recorded, witnessed, and then, following Marin Voss's sudden death shortly after the fever's end, quietly buried by advisors who preferred a simpler, less complicated ledger. Marin Voss, Elira whispered. That was my mother's name. I did not know, until I read this letter, that your mother was the healer who saved this kingdom during the fever, Kalen said quietly. I do not think my father knew either, or if he did, he chose not to remember it, because remembering it meant honoring a debt he had no interest in paying. Elira's hands had begun to shake in earnest now, the parchment trembling between her fingers. This means nothing changes, she said, though her voice did not sound convinced of it. My mother is dead. The promise was made to her, not to me. I am still a servant in this castle, whatever debt was owed and forgotten 20 years ago. That is not entirely true, Kalen said. The letter names your mother's surviving heir as the rightful recipient of the promised title and land, should such an heir ever be identified. You are that heir, Elira. The room seemed to tilt around her, not the way it had tilted on the morning of the coronation, but in a slower, more permanent way, the way a life tilts when the ground beneath it turns out to be built from something entirely different than expected. Why did your father hide this? She asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer. because acknowledging it would have meant elevating a servant girl to noble status, granting her land and title in a kingdom that does not forgive its rulers easily for disrupting the careful order of things. It was simpler to let the debt be forgotten and let the girl grow up believing she was nobody in particular. Elira sat down heavily, the parchment still gripped in her hands, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Outside the tall windows, evening had fully settled over the castle grounds, torches flickering along the outer walls, the distant sound of guards changing their posts, a world continuing exactly as it always had, entirely unaware that the woman sitting in the king's private study had just learned she was not who she believed herself to be. "I do not know what to do with this," Elira said finally. "Neither do I," Kaelin admitted. "But I know that Corwin and half that council would use this information against both of us the moment they learned of it, twisting it into further proof that my judgment cannot be trusted, that I am elevating a servant for reasons that have nothing to do with justice and everything to do with whatever they imagine is happening between us." "Is something happening between us?" Elira asked quietly, "or is that also something you have not yet decided how to tell me?" Kaelin crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, the same posture he had knelt in beside her on the coronation floor, though everything about the moment now felt entirely different. "I do not fully understand what is happening between us," he said. "I only know that since the day you collapsed at my feet, I have not been able to stop thinking about you, and that frightens me more than any council challenge ever could, because councils I know how to fight. This, I do not." The rupture, when it came, arrived without warning, the way real feeling often does, and neither of them tried to soften it or explain it away. Elira set the parchment down on the table beside her and, for the first time since she had entered this room, allowed herself to simply look at him, without dropping her gaze, without remembering her place, without any of the careful invisibility she had spent 3 years perfecting. Whatever came next, for the crown, for the council, for the letter that had just rewritten the entire shape of her life, it would not be decided that evening. But something between them had already shifted, quietly and permanently, and both of them understood it, even as neither one said the words out loud. News of the letter reached Lord Corwin 4 days before the second coronation, and it reached Lady Serana Draven within hours of that. Elira never learned exactly how the information traveled so quickly through walls thick enough to hold back armies, though she suspected, later, that Edwin's loyalty to Kaelin did not extend to every servant who worked alongside him, and that somewhere in the castle a coin had changed hands in exchange for a secret that was never meant to leave that locked drawer. Serana arrived at the study without an announcement, without Ronwyn trailing behind her, without any of the careful composure Elira had witnessed in their first meeting. Her eyes, when they landed on Elira, carried a fury that had clearly been building for days. "You knew," Serana said. "This entire time, you knew there was a debt owed to your family, and you let me believe you were nothing more than an opportunistic servant chasing a crown above her station." "I learned of it 4 days ago," Elira said. "The same as you, apparently, though I imagine you learned it from someone who was paid to tell you." "It does not matter how I learned it. What matters is that you are standing in this castle, about to be presented before the entire nobility as some long-lost heir, and I am the woman who was promised a marriage 12 years ago, and is now expected to simply step aside because a healer's daughter has decided to reach for a throne." "I have not decided anything," Elira said. "I did not ask for a debt. I did not ask for a title. I certainly did not ask to be standing here, arguing with you, while half the kingdom decides what to do about a crown that was never mine to want in the first place." Something in the plain exhaustion of that answer seemed to catch Serana off guard, cutting through whatever rehearsed fury she had arrived with. For a long moment she simply studied Elira, the way she had that first day, though the calculation in her eyes had shifted into something closer to genuine uncertainty. "You truly did not know," Serana said slowly. "No." Serana was quiet for a long time after that, long enough that Elira began to wonder whether the conversation had simply ended without either of them deciding to end it. When Serana finally spoke again, Her voice had lost the sharp edges it carried before. "I did not want this marriage either," she said. "Not truly. I have spent 12 years being told it was my duty to secure trade roads I have never once traveled myself, to a man who has never looked at me the way he apparently looked at you, across a crowded hall, on the worst day of your life." She smoothed the front of her gown, a gesture Alira suspected was meant to steady herself, rather than her clothing. "I do not know what I am now, if I am not the future queen my family raised me to become." "I imagine that is a frightening thing to sit with," Alira said quietly, and she meant it, because she understood, better than most, what it felt like to have the entire shape of your life rearranged without your consent. Serana left without another word, and Alira never learned exactly what conversation passed between her and House Draven in the days that followed, only that within a week, the betrothal was formally dissolved by mutual agreement, with trade concessions negotiated in its place that satisfied Serana's family without requiring a marriage neither party had ever truly wanted. The second coronation was held exactly 1 week after the first, in the same great hall, before the same 600 nobles, though this time Alira stood among them rather than at the edges, dressed not in the too-tight uniform of a servant, but in a simple gown of deep blue that Leora had helped her into that morning, hands trembling with an excitement Alira had not yet allowed herself to fully feel. Lord Corwin stood near the front of the assembly, his expression carefully neutral, though Alira suspected the narrow margin of his earlier defeat had cost him more allies than he cared to admit. The challenge to the succession had quietly dissolved once the council realized that removing Kaelin now, with a legitimate heir's claim newly surfaced and a broken betrothal already smoothed over with House Draven, would create far more instability than it resolved. Kaelin stood at the center of the hall, exactly where he had stood 1 week earlier, the priest once again holding the crown above his head on its velvet cushion. Alira watched him take the oath, the same words he had spoken before, though this time his eyes found hers across the crowded hall partway through, and held there, steady, for just long enough that a ripple of whispers moved through the nearest rows of nobles. The crown descended onto his head without interruption this time, and the hall erupted into the formal applause that 600 years of tradition demanded, though Alira, watching from her place among the assembly, thought the sound felt thinner than it should have, a performance rather than a true celebration, the way applause often sounds when everyone in the room is thinking about something other than what they are clapping for. What happened next was not written into any codex, and no advisor had prepared the hall for it. Kaelin did not turn immediately to address the council, as tradition required. He stepped down from the dais instead, crossed the same stretch of marble floor where Alira had collapsed a week earlier, and stopped in front of her, in full view of every noble house in the kingdom. "1 week ago," he said, his voice carrying easily across the silent hall, "I stopped my own coronation because a woman collapsed at my feet, and I discovered, in that single moment, that I cared more about her safety than about the crown waiting for me on that dais. Some of you have spent this past week wondering whether that decision reflected poorly on my judgment as your king." He paused, and the silence in the hall deepened, 600 people holding their breath at once. "I want to be clear about something, before this ceremony continues any further," Kaelin said. "This is Alira Voss, daughter of Marin Voss, the healer who saved over 400 lives during the fever that swept the Eastern Territories 20 years ago, a debt this crown owed her family and failed, for 2 decades, to honor. I intend to honor it now, fully and publicly, not because doing so is convenient, but because it is owed." A murmur rose through the hall, quickly silenced as Kaelin continued. "I also want this council, and every house represented here today, to understand something else. What began as an act of instinct 1 week ago, on this very floor, has become something I do not intend to hide or explain away for anyone's comfort. I do not yet know what shape it will take, whether as advisor, as partner, or as something this kingdom has not yet found the proper words for. But I will not stand before you today, freshly crowned, and pretend that the woman who changed the course of my coronation is simply a servant who happened to faint at the wrong moment. Elira felt every eye in the hall turn toward her, the same weight of attention that had once made her invisible reflex kick in, the old instinct to shrink, to disappear, to make herself small enough that no one would think to look twice. She did not shrink this time. She stood, spine straight, and let herself be seen. "I do not require this council's permission to acknowledge a debt owed," Kaelin said, turning back toward the assembly, "nor to determine who stands beside me as I govern this kingdom. But I would rather begin this reign with honesty than with the careful silences my father preferred. This is who I am. This is what I intend to build. Those of you who cannot accept that are welcome to bring your objections to the council chamber, where I will hear them, as I hear all matters of state. But I will not apologize for choosing decency over ceremony, not 1 week ago, and not today." The hall remained silent for a long moment after he finished, the kind of silence that could have broken in either direction, toward outrage or toward something else entirely. It was Lord Corwin of all people who broke it first, stepping forward with a slow, deliberate bow that surprised nearly everyone watching, including, Elira suspected, Corwin himself. "A king who acknowledges his debts," Corwin said, loud enough for the hall to hear, "is a king who can be trusted to acknowledge them again when it matters most. I withdraw my earlier objections, Your Majesty, and offer my congratulations to you both." Whether Corwin's words were sincere or simply the calculation of a man reading which way the wind had finally turned, Elira could not say for certain, and did not particularly care to guess. What mattered was the shift that moved through the hall after he spoke, noble houses exchanging glances, murmurs of approval slowly outweighing the murmurs of scandal, the entire mood of the room bending, gradually, toward acceptance. Kaelin crossed the last few steps between them, and this time, in front of 600 witnesses, he did not carry her away from the crowd. He simply stood beside her, close enough that their hands brushed, close enough that the gesture needed no further explanation. "You did not have to say all of that," Elira said quietly, for his ears alone. "Yes," Kaelin said, "I did." Outside the tall windows of the great hall, the afternoon light fell golden across the marble floor, where, 1 week earlier, a servant girl had collapsed and a king had made the first truly free decision of his life. The crown sat properly on his head now, the ceremony finally complete, but the truest thing that had happened in that hall had never been about the crown at all. It had been about a king who learned, in a single unguarded moment, that the weight of a title mattered far less than the person he chose to stand beside while wearing it, and a woman who discovered, standing in the same spot where she once fell, that she was strong enough to stay upright entirely on her own, with him simply, quietly, there beside her.